time and time again, I have heard testimonies, stories about how people have tithed. How it never seemed like we quite had enough. How it never seemed like ends could quite meet. But then they did once we started tithing. I had an older brother share a testimony with me. He said, you know, I'm ashamed that I didn't start tithing earlier in life. In fact, it wasn't until later. We were married, we had kids, I was making $30 a week. Now folks, this was a little while. He said we were making $30 a week and we could not make it. We couldn't make it. And then I was asked to teach Sunday school. And around the same time I was asked to teach Sunday school, I heard a message on tithing, and I was under such conviction, I went to the Lord and I said, I cannot tithe. And He said, test me and see. And so He said, we started tithing. And He stretched that $27 further than He ever stretched the $30. And He said, I was able to experience God's providence in a whole new way. And He had tithed ever since. I heard from a sister who said, you know what? Times got hard. In fact, this sister was a widow. And she said, times were awful. But I made up my mind, in my mind, that I would always tithe. That I would always give God His first. And He's never left me down. He's never left me down. Put the tithe to the test. Somehow when people gave to God first, everything else seemed to fall into place. Suddenly the ends could meet. How many of you remember Larry Burkett? Remember Larry Burkett? He died. I miss him. But he was a Christian financial guru. And I heard him on numerous occasions talk about the tithe. That the tithe was the foundation of financial freedom. Giving 10% to God through the local church. He would challenge people. He said, I would always challenge people, try tithing for a year. And if you are in worse financial shape, at the end of that year, you can stop tithing forever. And he said, after the decades and decades of telling people this, after telling thousands of people this, he has never had one person come back and say, you know what, I was in worse shape. By the end of the year, I was in worse shape. I'm quitting. That was Larry Burkett's word. But we don't need Larry Burkett's word as much as we need the prophet Malachi's. In verse 10, the prophet calls for the whole tithe to be brought into the storehouse. In the Old Testament, this was the temple. In the New Testament, this is the local church, which is the storehouse. The temple was the primary hub of God's working. It was where people were blessed with the word and the wisdom of God so that they could follow His will. The local church serves that same function today. Now we had those marvelous meetings with John. I'm going to share some stuff with you because he really challenged me. Did he challenge you? Was anybody else challenged? I'll tell you what. Sunday night on the way home, I got to talk to John. And he looked me right in the eye and he said, so Todd, why don't your people tithe? And I said, excuse me? He said, why don't your people tithe? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, do the math. And I said, okay, Johnny, help me understand. And Brother Johnny had very clear expectations of his church and tithing. In fact, he told me, if you want to have any kind of teaching position or leadership position of any kind, you need to tithe. And I said, well, that's very interesting, but how do you know if people tithe? And he said, oh, it's very easy. I go look in the books. You see, I know exactly how much everybody gives, and the elders do too. Now, I want to be crystal clear. I have absolutely no desire to know how much you give. No desire. But I did take Johnny's word. And I thought, okay, how important is it to know what we are giving corporately? And so I did a little bit of math. And I remember when we did the building project out front, we said there were approximately 70 giving units at our church. And our current budget, which we are in now, is approximately $176,000. Well, you divide that $176,000 by 70 giving units, and it comes to about $2,514. Multiply $2,514 out to come up with a yearly income, and it's around 25 grand. That would be our average giving for our church. Each giving unit would make about 25 grand. To give you some perspective, the national poverty line for our country is right around 24/7 for a family of 5. So what we could assume is to fulfill our budget this year, each giving unit in our church would be just above the national poverty level. Is that who we all are? Now, I'm not saying that there aren't folks here that are struggling, and I know there are some that are. But on the average, are we just about $300 or $400 above the poverty level? Or is Malachi speaking to us this morning? Does Malachi have a word for us in regards to what we are bringing to the storehouse? Well, if Malachi isn't speaking to you this morning, I pray that Jesus would. If you still have your Bibles, we're going to flip over to Matthew. That's the book right next door. That's the book right next door. There is a silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament. We're in Matthew 19. There's a silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament that we don't necessarily know what all happened. Did Israel get on track? Did that word from Malachi get people in the groove again to start bringing the full tithe in? We don't know. But what we do know is what Jesus taught. Now, little sermon review. How many of you remember how many times the word tithe was used in the Old Testament? Anybody remember? It was one of the fill in the blanks. Remember? 31. Excellent. Excellent. Does anyone know how many times the word tithe is used in the New Testament? Take a shot.
0.
0. 0 times is the word tithe used in the New Testament. You see, Jesus came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. The tithe is where giving begins, but it is only where giving begins. Jesus takes us to the next level, and it is where we need to go. Jesus takes us to the next level in so many different things, but He takes us to the next level also financially. Jesus gets to the heart of giving to God. Now, there are so many stories that Jesus brings to us in the New Testament about money. In fact, Jesus talked about money more than He did heaven, more than He did hell, more than He did anything. And I came under conviction because I'm like, what in the world? I did a 2-part mini-series on giving when Jesus spent most of the New Testament, a good chunk of it, the majority of it, talking about money and our relationship to it. Jesus is crystal clear when it comes to our worldly wealth. All of it is God. The tithe is a good start, but God might ask you for more. Just like He did the rich young ruler in Matthew 19, 16 through 30.